And so I want to talk about just poli-sci 101. All right, so what's a government? Just basically, what is a government?
A ruling body of the state that its purpose is practically to express the will of.
Yeah, so the point of a government is just the thing that's in charge of the society, is basically straight up what it is. And that's what a government is. So in the United States, it's all the people in Washington who do that, and then we have the state government, which is all the people up in Albany, and then we have city governments and local governments. And so yeah, all a government is a group of people who are given the power to make decisions for everybody. So in the United States, it's, amongst other people, the people we elect to go to the legislative branch, who then make decisions on what laws to pass, who pick the judges, et cetera, et cetera. So, why do we have governments? What's the point of them? Why don't we just say, screw it, it's not working, let's get rid of it entirely? UD.
Laws.
So, laws. So, why are laws a good thing, I guess is one way of putting it.
So that way, like, the whole population doesn't go in anarchy, or...
Yeah, so that's the word for what's it called when we don't have a government? It's called anarchy. And anarchy sounds really, really fun for like a short period.
The purge.
Yeah, it sounds really, really fun for like 10 minutes, and then you realize that it's utter chaos. Also, when the clearest case you can think of anarchy is just like think any zombie apocalypse. Like any zombie apocalypse story, the government has broken down, everything is chaos, it's every person for themselves. There's no certainty, and so that's the issue with anarchy, is if it's anarchic and no one's in charge, it's chaos. Because even if everyone starts off being very nice to each other, what ends up happening is if nobody's in charge in some sense, well, what ends up happening? If there's no official chosen body in charge, who ends up in charge to some degree? Yeah, the strongest one. Physically, if you can beat up everybody else, you become in charge because they stop fighting against you. Or what ends up happening is people are willing to do just about anything for their well-being. So that's the worry with anarchy. So the idea of a government is, why do we have them? They keep order. The point of a government is to make things run smoothly. And, why is it that in the United States we don't just say, screw it, you can do whatever you want in New York City? Well, it's because if you said you could do whatever you want, there's going to be somebody who decides that what they want to do is eat babies and then not get in trouble for it. So, why do we have governments? Because they are basically another definition is it's a legitimate seat of power for a government. It's the thing which everyone in the society recognizes as allowed to exert physical and economic power on other people. So for instance, I'm not allowed to arrest you, but members who are working for the government organizations are. I'm not allowed to punch you in the face if you punch me in the face. We're not allowed to get in a fight, but if somebody took a swing at certain people, they're allowed to swing back. Or I'm not allowed to, put on some shoes and grab a rifle and run into another country and claim I'm invading. I'm not allowed to do that. But if the government decides we need to invade someone and they all vote on it and they follow certain rules and then they invade, then other nations will go, all right, that's an okay invasion. So that's the point of a government. It's just to keep order. It's a legitimate seat of power. So what types are there other than democracy? So democracy is the one over here. And what's the defining feature of a democracy? What sets it apart from other types of governments?
Pluralism.
Pardon?
Pluralism.
Pluralism? So yeah, and it's pluralism in the sense of, in one sense, it ends up very often that we think of democracies as open to many ideas. But actually, the defining characteristic is what? Who's making the decisions in a democracy? People, so specifically citizens. So everybody in the government, or in the country that is a legitimate and hasn't been ruled out, gets to vote. So, or gets a right to make a decision. So, in a democracy, it's about many voting, or many making, or all even. So many/all. So that's the defining feature of a democracy, is that everybody is making the decisions. So, given that democracy is many or all, what other types of governments do we have? We've said over here, a not government is no one.
Oh. Monarchy.
So monarchy, and how many people have a say in monarchy?
One.
One. So, over here we've got monarchy. And then I heard another one with one. Dictatorship. Dictatorship. And what do these two have in common?
Autocracy.
It's just one, and the term for a government with just one person in charge is an autocracy. And there are other forms of autocracy as well. There's a theocracy. Does anyone know what a theocracy is?
Religious.
It's a religious figure leading the country. Yeah, so like you get like if you have a like religious leader or somebody who's being they are recognized as their word is law because they are in communion with the higher power. A dictatorship.
You mean the Pope?
So yeah, in back in the day when the Pope, the Pope is now in charge of a very little tiny country, which is inside the city of Rome.
Yeah.
But it used to be that the Papal States were like a sizable portion of Italy, and the person in charge of the Papal States was the Pope. And what gave him the right? Well, he was elected by the cardinals, and the idea was that he was chosen because he was the chosen of God. And okay, so we've got the one and we've got the many. What's going to be in the middle? The few.
Oligarchy.
Yep, oligarchy.
Oh yeah.
So, like in a or in an autocracy, there are different ways we can end up with oligarchy. Sometimes it's a matter of like who your parents were, like 10 families will rule. Other times it can be in terms of how much money you have, like the 10 richest people will be in charge. Other times it's like the heads of the biggest companies. These are all different ways you could have an oligarchy. So if these are the forms, what is good about each type? Because each of them have benefits and downsides. So we can talk about positives and negatives of all of them. What's the positive or negative of an autocracy? It's easier to think of negatives generally.
Straight chain of command. There usually very little middlemen in autocracy than there is in democracy, for example, that needs to pass through different filters in order to be enacted.
So that's one thing which is great about an autocracy. It's fast. If one person is in charge of making a decision, then to get something done, all you need is that one person to make the decision. So, for instance, why is it that there are pyramids in Egypt? The reason there's pyramids in Egypt is because there was one person in charge who decided, I want some goddamn pyramids.
Yeah.
And therefore, they were able to say, let's start making them, and the next thing you know, there are pyramids. Like, that's the story behind how it was able to get pyramids. And there weren't anything other than one very powerful guy on the border of a monarchy and a theocracy decided he wanted some pyramids. And so, in the United States, there are organizations that, roughly speaking, fall under the government heading that are autocratic.
Oh, I just want to point out democracy.
Oh, yeah.
So basically, like, democracy is like complete opposite of autocracy, meaning like autocracy is like establishment of oneself when it comes to like laws and like, you know,
Yeah.
and like establishing like punishments and the rewards. However, democracy is basically people's champion.
Yeah, so the idea behind a democracy is that everyone gets a say. And the reason why the government's in power is because everyone is having a say. So the autocracy is one person. So if one person decides it, it ends up going through.
I mean, this is not my personal opinion, but I think that autocracy proves or has the highest potential for what's the word I'm looking for? Objectivity.
Yeah, so here's the thing about an autocracy is because of the nature of an autocracy, if we made up an imaginary perfect person who was the nicest, the smartest, the kindest, the most everything good imaginable, and put that person in charge of a country, that country would run very quickly and very well. Because you can imagine that if one person's in charge, they don't need other opinions. And the less intelligent people won't, in some sense, pull them down. But what's the obvious issue with this?
That's like idealistic. Like,
Yeah, has anyone ever met, there's never been a person in human history who's perfect. Like, this does not exist. That's the issue here with autocracy is it relies really, really heavily on the quality of that one person. So if the person in charge is excellent at what they do, autocracies through history, you look at them and they work really, really well. Like if you look in history at a country in which it was a monarch who happened to be really good and really smart, you look at how much gets done in their lifetime and it's incredible. But the issue is, what ends up happening just as often as you end up with a great monarch or a great dictator? What happens just as often, if not more often? Yeah, you end up with a terrible one. And this is the flip side of the autocracy. The good is things get done fast, and if you've got a competent person in charge, things get done really well, really fast. The downside is you're just as likely to have a crazy person in charge. And as soon as you get a crazy person in charge and no one can stop them, you end up with some really crazy things. So if you ever want the history of like stranger than fiction, just read about things that were done by like world leaders with dictatorial or monarchic power throughout human history. And it's just like a who's who of crazy sorts of things happening, because nobody has the power to tell them to stop, and they're allowed to do anything they want because from that position of power. So you read about, what are some examples of things that end up going off the rails? Historical examples, go. Saddam Hussein would be one. You have somebody in a position of power who decided that he, because of his military power, could kill people of a minority group.
Hirohito.
Yeah, Hirohito had like official power, complete power. Gaddafi is another one. Yeah, we can look at military dictators. My personal favorite is just to look at some of these like monarchs from the Middle Ages, because so in a theocracy we said the defining characteristic of how these are all differentiated by how you choose the one person in charge. So for instance, theocracy, God chooses, or in some sense the church chooses. Dictatorship, what determines the dictator? It's pure strength. It's power. If you have the ability to kick everyone else's ass and then you put yourself in charge. That's a dictatorship. What determines a monarchy?
Both strength and church.
Yeah, it's a combination of strength and church filtered through what? What's the defining characteristic? If you are, well, let's go, where is there a monarchy these days, but it doesn't actually do anything, but what's the most famous monarchy that gets talked about in the tabloids in the United States? The British monarchy. They still have a queen. When she dies, who's going to become in charge, in theory? She doesn't actually do anything anymore, but if she did still have power, who becomes in charge of a monarchy when the last person in charge dies?
Prince William.
Yeah, a child of them. You know what's not a good way? You all have families. Think of your family. Is everyone in your family someone you love and would want in charge of an entire nation?
Yes, I love them.
You love them, but the fact that they're your family does not make them qualified to be anything other than your family. So what ends up happening is you end up with a parent has a child, and it's not a matter of and here's the other thing with monarchy is which child takes over. Different monarchies have different rules. So sometimes the parent chooses, other times it's just whoever's the oldest. The oldest is in charge. And what's the problem when you put the oldest in charge? Well, the oldest isn't necessarily the best one. And you know it's not a good way to become qualified for any job? Spending your entire life being rich and like a prince. Like, you do not necessarily become a hard worker or well knowledgeable if you have everything handed to you. Like, that's just a fact of the matter. And so the problem with monarchy is you end up with a lot of problems of who gets in charge. And so you end up with a child being put on charge of the government who's in no way qualified in terms of like, they're qualified in that we know who their dad or mom is, but that's about it. And the added fun of monarchy is the whole point is to keep everything in the family. So if you have 2 kids, and you give half of them half your stuff, then when they have kids, what's the best way to keep it all in the family?
Marry them together.
Yeah, have their kids marry each other. Which ends up, if you look at monarchies historically, there's a whole lot of inbreeding, which is a recipe for a lot of people who are even less qualified. So you end up with things like King Charles VI of France had a problem. He thought he was made out of glass and wouldn't let anyone come near him because he was so afraid he was going to break. and this was the man who was in charge of a country. Or you have times of Caligula, who was like the third Roman emperor, who there are many stories about him, but amongst other things, he was mad at all the people who were working for him, so he put his horse in charge. Yeah, he named his horse. He also, there's some rumor about that he got mad at the sea god Poseidon, so he ordered the army to throw spears into the ocean for a few days. Like, these are the sorts of things that you can do if you have dictatorial or autocratic power.
Like King Leopold?
Yeah, like literally, you name anything, people can, yeah, Leopold, you name it, if you've got complete power, no one can stop you and crazy stuff happens. However, if you're good at it and stuff gets done, and if you need things done quickly, an autocracy is great. So in the United States, as I said before, there are parts of our government organization that are autocratic. What parts of the US government or parts of the United States, like hierarchy, are organized on an autocratic system?
CIA.
CIA.
Yeah.
Maybe the judicial system.
Parts of the judicial system, but that one's a little bit more. There's some that are really clearly the case. Like even judges, no one judge like makes the decision fully. They have, if it's one in which like in the Supreme Court you have multiple judges, and in like a criminal you have a jury. So it's not quite. Where is it that if one person says it, the correct answer is, sir, yes, sir? The military. The military runs autocratically. Why is the military run as an autocracy? What is the number one thing you need to do in war? Pardon? Follow orders because what? Why is it so important to follow orders in the military?
Because otherwise death.
Yeah, death. The stakes are super high, and it's another one of those things where everyone doing something together is better than everyone doing their own thing. And also, imagine what would happen if you had two armies. One of them is commanded in an autocratic system where a general says something, it gets passed down to lieutenant generals who get passed down, and the moment they say something, within 2 hours the army's moving. The other one is in a democracy, where first off, they put forward 4 ideas of what they're going to do. And then they all debate about it for 2 weeks. And then they decide this one's the best, and now we're going to write about it. And so they decide, like, first we need to add in this amendment, and then that. What's the downside of this? By then the war is over because you've lost. And that's the point of autocracy. It gets stuff done quickly. The downside is, when stuff goes wrong, it goes really wrong really quickly. So, what's an oligarchy? It's a few. What's the issue with a government of the few?
Technically, like, it's almost similar to the autocracy, but in the sense that instead of being one person, it's like a family.
Yeah, so there's still a lot of the same issues with autocracy carry over to oligarchy. And so, for instance, if you have an oligarchy where the people deciding are just 10 people, it's very easy for those 10 people still to share views and be biased. Yeah. So if you have one crazy person, it's not as much of a problem in an oligarchy, but odds are the oligarchs are going to look out for themselves above other people. So if you've got the 10 richest people running the country, then what are they going to try to do? Well, make their own position as the 10 richest people better. If you've got the 10 people in charge of, I don't know, like, you just have I don't know, you randomly get born into a position. So like the Minister of War and the Minister of Finance, and that's all like dynastic or hereditary, you're still going to have sorts of problems. So oligarchies don't fully solve the autocracy problem. They get around some of it, but you don't fully have complete like equality, especially because the defining feature of an oligarchy is the person who's deciding who's in charge are not anyone other than like some random thing like how much money you have or what position you have or who your family was.
That's also my point. It's like, therefore, like, what would be the qualifications to be in an oligarchy? Whereas, like, in an autocracy, it's just based on the individual.
Yeah, and that's another issue, is there's no good way to decide what 10 people should be in charge of a country. Like, and I keep using 10 just because it's a nice simple number. But like how would you decide, like, what's the best way of deciding? Well, it seems like,
do they all have to work together? Or
yeah,
like,
exactly. There doesn't seem a good way of deciding what 5 people to put in charge. Seems like anyone you choose is gonna be unfair in some way. If you're doing it based on who their parents were, well, as we said, that's not a very useful way. If we base it on how much money you have, okay, they're gonna be biased. If you base it on what careers they have, you'll be ignoring other. There's no real way of picking a small group. So, what's the last way? We go with democracy. And democracy is the many, or everyone. So democracy comes in, well, two main forms. What are the two main forms of democracy?
Direct and indirect.
Direct and indirect, or direct and, I'm just gonna cut to the chase and go with representative.
Strictly our.
So, what's a direct democracy?
That is when everyone participates in deliberation.
Yeah, everybody votes. Every single person votes on every single thing. So, we could turn this class into a direct democracy right now. The direct democracy is, should we put a hard cap on this class for 10 minutes or 15? Raise your hand if you want to end exactly at 1:05. Raise your hand if you want to make sure we're done exactly by 1:10.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so it looks like you all chose the longer one.
Well, because
Interesting.
we thought the second option was gonna be better, Professor.
Yeah, well, you didn't listen well. Whatever.
Sorry if I'm
I feel like, okay, so basically, we're gonna finish, now this is gonna be an autocracy. We're finishing at 1:05. That's an autocracy. I made the decision, I ignored all of you. So yeah, but basically, that's a direct democracy. We all vote on everything. So that is the most open form of government imaginable. Everybody gets a say on every single decision. What's a representative democracy?
So like a representative democracy is when you have, you still vote, but afterwards you vote for your vote goes to an elected official who then brings these votes to, I guess whatever.
Yeah, so here's a direct democracy. Here's an issue. Who votes on it? Well, everyone. So everyone votes on the issue itself. Now, in a representative democracy, you've got an issue, and who votes on the issue? Well, representatives, who are professional politicians who all they do all day, every day, is be a politician. And then, who picks the representatives?
People.
The people. So the people then vote on the representatives. So it's just you add an extra layer in. So, which of these two better describes the United States of America?
Representative.
Yeah, representative.
Representative.
Why do you go with a representative democracy over a direct democracy? When is it a good idea to do a direct democracy versus a representative?
No chance. It's impractical.
Yeah, this is impractical as soon as you get above like 15 people.
Yeah.
Direct democracies work really well in clubs, in like small groups, things like this. You need, like, we've all been part of some organization where, like, you know, the what's it called, the Robert's Rules of Regulation or whatever the hell they're called. The like, I first that, I second that, and everyone gets a vote. And as long as the group is small enough, it's fine. But as soon as the group gets too big, it just becomes totally impractical. Imagine if instead of voting in the United States once every 2 years for our House of Representatives, we instead voted